This world is not what you think it is. This world is not what you think it is.
They're making it so obvious we didn't go to the moon, right? It's so obvious that it's ridiculous. NASA, which gets $58 million a day. And by the way, when people say, why would we even go back to the moon? There's nothing there. You have scientists from the 60s saying it would be the greatest place to have a scientific station imaginable. No atmosphere. You can do tests. You can see things that you would never see. You would have golf tournaments, blah, 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 blah. Okay, 1/6 the gravity. They did not act 1/6 the gravity one bit. The rovers would not have driven that way. Each rover cost the taxpayers $60 million in 1970s money. It's just nonsense. Every president has said that we would go back and then failed. Even our private sector has failed. No other country has ever went back to the moon. Technology has advanced to a degree that you can't imagine. And yet they're saying that we can't go back because we no longer have the technology. What about the calculations? Apparently it was one black woman that did it by hand. This is from NASA. It was one black woman. They did a movie about her. Did it by hand, and now they can't find it. Okay, what about the telemetry data? 1 ton of data was reused. And now the media is saying that an intern bought them at a yard sale. You can't make this shit up. When has technology went in reverse? What other time in history has an explorer went someplace, planted a flag from a nation, and no other nation followed suit? None. Russia, China, Israel, none of them ever went again. Name one other time. Never once. Trust me, I'm wearing a lab coat.
And talk about the things that interested us most, in particular the things that occurred on and about the moon. We will use a number of films and slides which most of you have already seen, with the intent of pointing out some of the things that we observed on the spot, which may not be obvious to those of you who are looking at them here from the surface of Earth.
Sonic moon. Plans were made by the bankers in the back room. Get the president out of the way and hire Stanley Kubrick. Under the Masonic moon. The Masonic moon. Everyone hoped that the boys would come home soon. One more day and they'll drop from the plane and splash into the ocean. Under the Masonic moon. Von Braun and his conspirators got a free ride to the States. They turned Nazi into NASA. They just couldn't wait. Under the Masonic moon. The Masonic moon. Plan Plans were made by the bankers in the back room. The owl sees into the night, and the secret will never be told. Under the Masonic moon, under the Masonic moon, plans were made by the bankers in the back room. The owl sees into the night, and the secret will never be told.
99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. Right away, Houston. Red, good.
The owl sees into the night, and the secret will never be told.
Okay, 30 seconds. 308 your number. Okay, coming through 1,500 feet, and H-dot looks good. Right away, Houston.
We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
The 1969 Apollo moon landings, the 1976 Viking and other subsequent Mars landings, all images showing a spherical rotating Earth, all supposed space stations and satellites orbiting the ball Earth, every Hubble photoshopped image, and the entire NASA organization are one big hoax created to convince you that the Earth is not flat. Over the past 5 decades, through lies and photo and video trickery, the Freemasons at NASA have effectively convinced the entire world to believe several myths totally contrary to our senses and personal experience. They claim, contrary to our senses, that many of us are standing upside down, thinking we are right side up, on the underside of a spinning ball Earth. They claim, contrary to our senses, that we are reeling through space at millions of miles per hour, that stars are actually suns, that the sun is actually bigger than the moon, and that most stars are actually bigger than the sun. We can clearly see and feel, however, that we are standing right side up on a motionless, flat Earth. The sun and moon are the same size, the stars are clearly smaller than both, and cannot be proven to be distant suns in other solar systems. With a little Photoshop, rocket technology, and a bunch of lying Freemasons, NASA has convinced nearly everyone on Earth to disbelieve their own eyes, common sense, and experience. As mentioned in a previous chapter, stars and planets have often been seen through the moon, which means it is semi-transparent, and if the moon is semi-transparent, it cannot be the solid, spherical planetoid claimed by modern astronomy. Samuel Shenton, president of the Flat Earth Society, was quoted before the Apollo supposed moon landings, stating that stars have been seen through the moon. The astronauts had better be ready to come right back because there isn't anything much to land on. Samuel Shenton also said, "We so-called flat earthers, observing certain false presentation used by the Americans in TV and films showing the orbits and descents of their space vehicles, wish to place our views before young and interested people. In so doing, we trust that no more jibes about flat earthers will be occasioned from Prime Minister Wilson of the Socialist Party and Enoch Powell of the Conservative Party." Many of the first people to unequivocally call out the NASA moon landings as being a staged hoax, besides knowledgeable flat earthers, were professional photographers. When the official NASA photographs of the moon are closely examined, it is clear that many were taken inside a studio using repetitive backgrounds, artificial lighting, wires, and cranes. Others were composite desert photographs with the backgrounds blacked out and astronauts superimposed in. Award-winning British photographer David Percy, photo analyst and historian Jack White, photographer for Nexus magazine publisher Marcus Allen, and many others have put their professional reputations on the line to expose NASA's photographic evidence. David Percy from Dark Moon, Apollo, and the Whistleblowers says, "The numerous inconsistencies clearly visible in the Apollo photographic record is quite irrefutable. Some of the many errors we evidence were due to haste and poor thinking. Others were deliberately planted by individuals we have dubbed whistleblowers, who were determined to leave evidence of the faking in which they were unwillingly involved. Probably the most emphatic of these whistles was a bottle that rolled across the moon landscape on the TV screens in Western Australia during a live transmission from the moon. None of the Apollo missions brought any extra studio lighting with them on the lunar lander, so the sun should be the only light source on the moon, and in all pictures taken there. In that case, the light should only come from one direction, and all shadows should be cast in the opposite direction. However, in dozens of official NASA photos, there are shadows being cast in up to 3 directions simultaneously, often at up to 90-degree angles, which can only be the result of multiple light sources not present on the moon. Several pictures even show overhead spotlights reflecting in astronauts' helmets, and multiple lens flares originating from 2 or more light sources. Analyzing several images from the 6 missions shows repeated background features, the exact same hills, dunes, craters being used over and over again in supposedly different places on the moon, as well as visible foreground and backdrop lines indicative of a studio set. In images from Apollo 11, Buzz Aldrin can be seen wearing different color gloves and different length boots in pictures that were supposedly taken within minutes of each other. If Buzz was really in the vacuum of space in a pressurized spacesuit, he certainly would not have had time or reason to depressurize and repressurize his suit just to make such fashion adjustments. Some pictures show the lunar rover with no tracks anywhere around it. Others show rover tracks all over the foreground while it is yet to be unpacked and unloaded. A couple pictures even show what appear to be sneakers and ladies' heels tracks on the moon, in addition to astronauts' boot prints. Ralph Renee from NASA Mooned America says, "If you look at the backgrounds of most NASA pictures, there is a relatively sharp transition line where anything beyond becomes smooth and featureless. This is a sure sign of a grade Z studio backdrop. Every time the American flag is shown, there is a great deal of light on it, even if it's in the shadow side of the lunar lander. Also, NASA never filmed either stars or planets. The reason is simple. Before the era of computer enhancement, the stars would have been impossible to fake accurately enough to fool the world's amateur astronomers." Sam Colby, in Apollo Fake, says, "Michael J. Tuttle faked the so-called Apollo training simulation photographs using Photoshop 3 and then posted them on NASA websites as being genuine photographs taken on the moon. I regularly get email from people claiming that digital manipulation of photographs was not available back in 1969. People have been creating fake photographs ever since the camera was invented, and who is saying the pictures were faked back in 1969 anyway? People don't understand that the majority of NASA's fake moon pictures were created in the mid-90s. The proof lies in the fact that most do not appear in any books or magazines prior to 1990. 95% of NASA's fake moon pictures on their websites were never seen prior to the launch of the internet. They had to produce a considerable number of fake moon pictures for all 6 missions, otherwise the public would want to know why there were so few. Not all of NASA's fake Apollo pictures have been altered with Photoshop. The main Apollo 11 picture of Buzz Aldrin, as well as press-released pictures from Apollo 12 and Apollo 14 showing astronauts holding the flag. All of these press release pictures were taken in the fake moonscape at Langley Research Center and did not require any alteration to pass off as a moon photograph." Another glaring mistake is that none of NASA's images or videos show stars in the background as they should, just complete blackness, likely because exact star maps as they should appear from the moon would be quite difficult to fake. The testimony of different astronauts on different missions in their autobiographies and interviews just muddies the waters even more, some of them bragging about the astonishingly brilliant light of the stars, and others saying, they don't remember seeing a single star while on the moon. Such inconsistencies and the fact that none of NASA's moon pictures feature stars or planets in their appropriate positions should raise a red flag that these astronauts were not on the moon. Many pictures of the sun on the moon are clearly spotlights and not the sun, including AS 1466 9306, AS 1246 6765, and AS 1140 5935. NASA image AS 1249 7278 clearly shows several studio lighting lens flares caused by multiple overhead lights. Image AS 1469 9089 shows studio lighting reflecting off a black background. Image AS 17 151 23201 shows a shadow on the ceiling of space as the lunar lander lifts off. Images AS 16 118 18894, AS 17 134 20471, AS 1144 6581, and AS 1144 6642 show crude computer retouching to hide cables and background problems and add the round Earth, but NASA claims they're original photographs. AS 1466 9306 shows shadows of reticule crosshairs suspended in air over a print underneath, proving it to be doctored and not an original, as claimed. Image AS 1140 5922 of the lunar lander supposedly on the moon shows a pathetic 1969 attempt at creating high-tech looking equipment using what appears to be construction paper, gold foil, scotch tape, and metal shower rods. The idea that the piece of junk shown in this official NASA photograph flew to the moon and back is so ludicrous it's laughable. AS 17 148 22 756 also clearly shows, when enlarged, that the Apollo 17 command module was almost completely held together by scotch tape. In AS 16 113 18 339, there is a rock with the letter C clearly engraved into it, as well as another C drawn into the dirt next to it. This is characteristic of fake stage rocks on a stage setup, where the set designer demarcates prop positions, and not something we should see on the moon. Ralph Renee in NASA Mooned America says, "The large rock in the left foreground is clearly marked with a big capital C. The bottom right corner has a crease similar to that caused by wetting a folded newspaper. This makes it a showbiz flap rock, which the people who work in Hollywood studios throw at visitors. They used to be made from wet newspaper and paste and showed similar flaps. Stage rocks are usually placed by stagehands over similarly lettered markers positioned by the set designer. Did NASA really carry fake boulders and stagehands onto the moon?" NASA image AS 1140 5926 shows a close-up of the footpads of the lunar lander without a speck of dust on them and without a burn print under its 10,000-pound thrusters, like it was just gently set down in place. NASA scientists in their own documents were worried about the LEM falling into its own massive burn radius, yet there it sits with no burn print and spotless clean pads. Even the astronauts' boot prints made deep impressions in the moon dust, yet the lander's 10,000-pound thrusters left not a trace, no blast hole, and no dust on the pads. Eugene Cernan of Apollo 10 and 17 said in an interview that as they descended in the lander that the engine was very loud, yet when Alan Bean of Apollo 12 was asked the same question, he answered that you couldn't hear the engine at all in the vacuum of space. I tend to believe Alan, because watching the Apollo 17 liftoff sequence from the moon, it is clear that the LEM is being hoisted by a crane from above and not propelled by thrusters from below. Ralph Renee says, "I remember watching the first astronauts land on the moon and wondering why the TV pictures were so murky. We watched two blurry white ghosts who did little or nothing while they lurked in the shadow of the lunar lander. NASA seemed to have lost 100 years of photographic progress. It was boring, but I believed. During the next few years I caught glimpses of subsequent missions as they flashed in color upon my TV screen, and I believed." pictures improved with each mission, and toward the end, the Apollo program, the moon buggy tore up the moon's surface while NASA began to talk up a Martian adventure. I still believed in apple pie, the CIA, and NASA. Years later, watching a TV show, I thought I saw the moon flag ripple on the airless moon. The worm of suspicion slid into my system. I then began watching NASA film clips very closely and with less emotion. As those rose-colored glasses slipped lower on my nose, I began to notice flaws in the pictures. The astronauts and their backpacks weighed less than 75 pounds on the moon, yet they left deep footprints in the moon dust and gravel. The blast of a rocket engine that lowered the 33,000-pound LEM on the moon's surface left no crater, and apparently it didn't even blow away the dust beneath the footpads. Strange. Here on Earth, footprints usually require some type of wetting agent. There is no wet on the moon. When the video evidence is examined, even more anomalies are found. In certain frames, light pings can be seen reflecting off overhead stage wires attached to astronauts' backpacks. In one Apollo 16 clip, an astronaut falls to his knees and is quickly jerked back up to his feet by what can only be an unseen wire hoisting him straight upwards. One of the more obvious video anomalies is how several Apollo missions show American flags flapping around in the non-existent space wind. The moon is supposed to have no atmosphere, and so the flags should remain perfectly still, but can often be seen moving about quite boisterously. NASA claims the astronauts brushing up against them could cause this, but it's clearly not the case, as the flags stay waving for long periods of time with no astronauts touching or even near them. Another interesting video anomaly is discovered by playing NASA's moon footage at 2 times speed, then watching the astronauts walking, running, jumping, or cruising around on their little buggy. Without the speed adjustment, there is a low-gravity type illusion as the astronauts seem to float, drift, and glide slowly and smoothly along. But once they are seen at 2 times speed, it becomes clear that they are in normal gravity, walking, running, jumping, and cruising at normal speeds. They simply reduce the play speed by 50% in post-production, and voila, instant moon motion. William Cooper said, "Most, if not all, of the photos, films, and videotape of the Apollo moon missions are easily proven to be fake. Anyone with the slightest knowledge of photography, lighting, and physics can easily prove that NASA faked the visual records of the Apollo space program. They are so obviously fake that when the discrepancies are pointed out to unsuspecting viewers, an audible gasp has been heard. Some have actually gone into a mild state of shock. Some people break down and cry. I have even seen others become so angry that they have ripped the offending photos to shreds while screaming incoherently." Not only is the video record fraught with fraud, but NASA claims the original Apollo 11 videos have conveniently disappeared from their records, so no one can analyze them for authenticity. That's right. They spent over $30 billion of American taxpayer money traveling to the moon and then lost the video evidence. Those blurry, ghostly, black and white images shown on TV were purposely lousy because NASA insisted at the time that all TV networks must broadcast directly from a big screen display in their operations room, a mandate which all the major networks accepted, and so what the public saw was just a video of a poorly magnified video, and now it is impossible to watch the original. Not only has the Apollo 11 original disappeared, but NASA claims to have lost all original audio tapes from the Apollo missions, and that their contractors have lost all prints and plans for the lunar rover, LEM lander, and Apollo ship engines. What are the chances that these are actually lost? And what are the chances that NASA simply cannot have the public scrutinizing their records because of what might be exposed? William Cooper said, "Exploration of the moon stopped because it was impossible to continue the hoax without being ultimately discovered, and of course they ran out of pre-filmed episodes. No man has ever ascended higher than 300 miles, if that high, above the Earth's surface. No man has ever orbited, landed on, or walked upon the moon in any publicly known space program. If you doubt this, please explain how the astronauts walked upon the moon's surface enclosed in a spacesuit in full sunlight, absorbing a minimum of 265 degrees of heat surrounded by a vacuum. Temperatures on the moon supposedly range from 279 degrees below zero during the depths of the lunar night, which is far colder than even Antarctica's coldest winter, and up to 243 degrees above zero at lunar midday, which is hotter than boiling water. NASA claims their special suits are fitted with both heating and cooling systems, but nothing which could withstand these incredible temperatures. These suits are also supposedly pressurized to keep the vacuum non-pressure of space from bursting their blood vessels, but they clearly have deep creases and wrinkles all over. Astronauts in true pressurized suits would look like the Michelin Man bubbling out. Also, the amount of radiation in space, especially through the Van Allen belt, is far too intense for them to be spacewalking in such flimsy suits. One Russian study found that the amount of radiation present on the moon would require astronauts to be clothed in 4 feet of lead in order to avoid instant death. John Malden, a NASA physicist, said they would need at least 2 meters of thick shielding around them at all times, yet there they are, bouncing around the moon in their 2-inch thin suits. Another solid proof of NASA living up to its forked serpent tongue logo are the many supposed moon rocks given to museums the world over by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. Shortly after Apollo 11, private investigator Paul Jacobs reported asking the U.S. Department of Geology head whether he had examined the moon rocks and if he could verify their authenticity. To which the geologist simply laughed and insinuated that people high in the U.S. government knew all about the cover-up. More recently, in 2009, curators at Amsterdam's Rijksmuseum investigated their moon rock, personally given to them by Armstrong and Aldrin in 1969, only to find that it was actually a worthless piece of petrified wood. Bill Casing, another moon hoax researcher, worked at Rocketdyne, where NASA Saturn V rocket engines were built, and became exposed to documents pertaining to the Mercury, Gemini, Atlas, and Apollo NASA programs, which proved trickery was afoot. Casing said of the documents that one does not need an engineering or science degree to determine that a hoax was being perpetrated. He wrote a book about his findings called "We Never Went to the Moon, America's $30 billion Swindle." In it, he exposes how NASA staged both the Apollo 1 fire and Challenger accident, deliberately murdering the astronauts on board to silence them. Before the first Apollo mission ever even cleared the launch pad, 11 NASA astronauts died in highly suspicious accidents. Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White were all cremated together in an Apollo capsule fire during a completely unnecessary and dangerous test where they were strapped down and locked into a 100% oxygen chamber which incinerated the 3 of them to death in seconds. 7 other astronauts, Ted Freeman, Charles Bassett, Elliot See, Russell Rogers, Clifton Williams, Michael Adams, and Robert Lawrence, died in 6 separate airplane crashes, and Ed Givens in a car crash. 8 of these deaths were in 1967 alone. So many astronauts coincidentally dying under such circumstances is highly unlikely and lends credence to the idea that these were intentional hits by the Masons trying to find the right people to sell their hoax. One of the most outspoken of the fallen astronauts was Gus Grissom. By 1967, Grissom had become increasingly irritated and vocally negative about NASA's chances of ever landing on the moon. He stated the odds were pretty slim and famously hung a lemon on the Apollo capsule after it repeatedly failed safety testing procedures. Grissom threatened to go public with his complaints about the LEM and even told his wife Betty, "If there ever is a serious accident in the space program, it's likely to be me." Right after his murder, government agents raided Grissom's house before anyone had been informed about the fire or his death. They removed all his personal papers and his diary, never to be returned. Ralph Renee writes, "In a prosecutorial mode, I accuse NASA, the CIA, and whatever super-secret group that controls the shadow government of these United States of fraud on the grandest scale imaginable, of murder by arson, and of larceny of over $40 billion in conjunction with the Apollo program that allegedly landed men on the moon. I also accuse them of violating a federal law against lobbying by government-funded entities and of serial murder of low-level NASA employees, witnesses, and other citizens who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Such accusations seem incredible because none of us ever want to believe our governmental father is deceiving us. However, by the end of this book, even the most trusting reader will have no doubt that NASA mooned America. In 2001, investigative journalist and award-winning filmmaker Bart Sibrel produced the excellent documentary A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. When requesting footage for his movie, Sibrel was sent, either by mistake or by a well-meaning whistleblower, an official raw-slated NASA clip from the Apollo 11 mission showing a young Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, and Michael Collins for almost an hour using transparencies and camera tricks to fake shots of around Earth. They communicate over audio with control in Houston about how to accurately stage the shot, and someone keeps prompting them on how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired effect. First, they blacked out all the windows, except for a downward-facing circular one, which they aimed the camera towards from several feet away. This created the illusion of a ball-shaped Earth surrounded by the blackness of space, when in fact it was simply a round window in their dark cabin. Neil Armstrong claimed at this point to be 130,000 miles from Earth, halfway to the moon, but when camera tricks were finished, the viewer could see for themselves the astronauts were not more than 100 miles above the Earth's surface, likely flying in a high-altitude plane. Sam Colby writes in NASA, numerous anomalies and scams abound. Many gullible people still accept NASA's claim of sending men to the moon without bothering to carry out any research or investigation to see if NASA are indeed telling the truth. There are some who will never accept the moon missions were faked, regardless of how much factual evidence of a fake is put before them. In 2004, Bart Sibrel completed a second documentary entitled Astronauts Gone Wild, where he set out to film interviews with Apollo astronauts and ask them to swear on the Bible that they walked on the moon. In reaction to Sibrel's accusations, many of the astronauts indeed went wild. John Young of Apollo 10 and 16 threatened to knock him in the head, then ran away into a nearby closing elevator. Ed Mitchell of Apollo 14 literally kicked him out the door and threatened to shoot him. Buzz Aldrin punched him square in the face. The documentary is a fascinating psychological study, watching the astronauts repeatedly squirm and quickly escalate to threats and violence. They behave more like pathological liars than honorable cosmonauts. Many of them have battled depression and alcoholism since returning from the moon as well. Buzz Aldrin was once asked at a NASA banquet what it felt like to first step onto the lunar surface. He staggered to his feet speechless, then left crying uncontrollably. On the 25th anniversary event for the Apollo 11 landing, one of the few interview appearances Armstrong ever made, he gave a cryptic speech basically telling the young people in attendance that there were many truths about Apollo that they could uncover if they dug deep enough. He said, holding tears back, "Today we have with us a group of young students, America's best. To you we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers." In the past 45 years, the Masons in Hollywood and NASA have only gotten more adept at Photoshop, CGI, and faking shots of Earth from space. Hit movies like Apollo 13 and Gravity show how realistic and convincing these soundstage, green screen, computer-built environments can be. People believe it more too. A night's newspaper survey taken just after the Apollo landings found 30% of Americans were suspicious of NASA's trip to the moon. A Gallup poll taken in 1999 found only 6% of Americans had any doubt about the Apollo astronauts walking on the moon.
because Apollo 17 is the final Apollo flight, because the theme of our mission is that this isn't the end. This is, we've just begun to crawl with the Apollo program as mankind. We're just now hoping that we can learn to begin to walk and then press on to the future. And Apollo 17 is sort of an opportunity, I think, to remind not just our country, but the world that this is a position that mankind is in today.
It's these kind of views that stick with you forever. I'll tell you, if they're ever... The scenery, something like I've never seen before, for sure.
Got you glued to the windows, I guess, huh?
I don't think I've ever seen anything like it.
This is Apollo Control, Apollo 17, moving across the Atlantic now. And on the next revolution, the spacecraft will be on its way to the moon, doing the translunar injection maneuver.
Guys, I've got the word you wanted to hear. You are go for TLI. You're go for the moon.
If I have seen farther than others, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. Standing on the shoulders of giants.
Actually made the moon my home for over 3 days. You become detached from one planet. You become detached from Earth, which is your identity with reality. From most of the other landing sites were to look at the Earth. I mean, I just glance over my shoulder.
Standing on the shoulders of giants.
The Earth is about 4 times bigger than a full moon looks to us from Earth. 4 times bigger than a full moon looks to us from Earth. Actually made the moon my home for over 3 days. You become detached from one planet. You become detached from Earth.
We want to express a feeling to the people who made it possible, that they've done a great thing for this nation and for the world, and let them know that it's not the end, but it truly is a beginning.
There is orange soil. Well, don't move it till I see it. It's all over. Orange. I can see it from here. It's orange. Crazy.
It's not the end, but it truly is the beginning.
Orange. I can see it from here. It's orange. Crazy.
If I have seen farther than others, it's by standing on the shoulders of giants. Shoulders of giants.
Crazy.
Shoulders of giants.
Crazy.
Shoulders of giants.
Crazy.
Shoulders of giants.
Crazy. Engine stop, engine arm, proceed, command override off, boat control ahead, hold, pings auto. Okay, Houston, the Challenger has landed.
As Ron Evans doing his orbital science task.
Crazy.
Orbital photography. Less than a minute away now as Cernan and Schmidt aboard Challenger on the lunar surface are awakened for the third moonwalk.
Crazy. If I may, I'd like to remind everybody this valley of history has seen mankind complete its first evolutionary steps into the universe.
Well, because of the responsibility that's been given them, not just simply the opportunity, but you know, it's a big thing when someone puts a spacecraft in your hands and puts a lot of faith in you to do a job that is not meaningful just on a small scale. It's not meaningful just on a small scale, but it's meaningful on a large, on a worldwide scale. The responsibility, for instance, of Neil Armstrong.
Like that Neil Armstrong guy. Have you seen him on the talk shows?
Neil Armstrong, you mean the first man to walk on the moon? That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
What a fish story!
Yeah.
Man, and they're buying it! And they're buying it!
Reach out, touch space.
And they're buying it!
Your own personal Jesus. Someone to hear your prayers. Someone who cares.
There is no capability to do that today.
Your own personal Jesus.
There is no capability to do that today.
Someone to hear your prayers. Someone who's there.
There is no capability to do that today.
Oh, that fake news. What a fish story!
Feeling unknown and you're all alone. Flesh and bone by the telephone. Lift up the receiver, I'll make you a believer. I know to live, you know I'm a forgiver. Reach out, touch ground. Reach out, touch
Man, and they're buying it!
Reach out, touch space.
fly in Earth orbit. That's the farthest that we can go. And this new system that we're building is going to allow us to go beyond and hopefully take humans into the solar system to explore. So the moon, Mars, asteroids, there's a lot of destinations that we could go to.
When you're no longer Earthlings, how do you navigate? You can use the stars.
Yeah, you know, actually on my very first mission, we went up and when you're in space and you're looking into deep space and you're on the sun side of the orbit, the sunlight washes out all the starlight, so you can't see any stars, just like here on Earth. But then when you look out into deep space away from the sun, it's the darkest black you can imagine, right? And so what happens is you really lose your depth perception. You can't tell if something's close by or far away.
Whilst
from
Mark
space,
Cameron. This is from Mark Cameron.
Whilst in space, have you ever looked away from Earth into the black void?
Yeah.
All
because
the
you
time.
can see. You can see the stars.
Oh yeah.
You know, and pretty much all the time you can see the stars.
And I had just a few things I wanted to share from this very unique vantage point. In the view outside from our cupola module, which has windows on all sides and allows us to see marvelous places, you know, coming and going, and also just gives us that perspective of looking down on the Earth and realizing that we are in an orbiting spaceship, and that when I look out at the stars and I see, you know, so many stars and planets and Hello and welcome to the International Space Station. I'm Katie Coleman, a NASA astronaut, MIT graduate from 1983, and this is my world, at least for the past few months and another month. Really happy to be here with you today and to share this place with you. I'm very privileged to live aboard the International Space Station and commute to work here every day, and I love pretty much every single minute of it.
Well, when we look out the window, Emerson, the thing that we see and notice the most is planet Earth. Some of our best windows face the Earth, and it's very blue and very beautiful. So it's what we look at the most from the window. But we can also see stars if we're on the dark side of Earth, and planets.
The sky is deep black when viewed from the moon, as it is when viewed from cislunar space, the space between the Earth and the moon. The Earth is the only visible object other than the sun that can be seen.
Since the moon has no atmosphere, then a daytime picture, if you're there in the daytime of the moon, you see a full night sky of stars, even with the sun in the sky as well.
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics.
The thing about Carl Sagan, billions of stars, there really are billions and billions of stars, and you can see them. In fact, they're so numerous, it's very difficult to pick out the constellations you and I see here on the ground. And I live in Colorado, and you get up on a clear night in Colorado up in the mountains where there's no light, and you can see all these stars. Well, multiply that by 1,000. That's what it's like in space. And then when you're outside doing a spacewalk, and you have that one or two opportunities where you can let your eyes adjust, you can start to notice that some of the stars have colors we don't see here on the ground.
The biggest visual surprise was just how black the sky was. You have a brilliant sun, brighter than any sun you normally would see, even here in New Mexico. You have these extraordinarily high mountains. We were in a valley deeper than the Grand Canyon. But then you have this black sky, a sky blacker than black, as the old Vidicon expression used to be.
Just the inherent beauty of it, the velvet, bottomless bucket of the universe.
In like just hanging there in a vast sea of darkness, and the most frightening darkness that you could ever imagine.
This is just CGI. Go to Hollywood, watch any Star Trek or whatever movie, and they have the same effects. But these are by some space agencies like ESA, and you believe it, because it's your government supporting this, and they are only acting in your best interest, Right.
The sky is almost white with the light of the universe, with the uncountable number of stars.
It's an unfathomable blackness, like with a texture you feel like you could stick your hand into.
I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see. I don't remember seeing any.
Uncountable number of stars.
I don't remember seeing any.
You know, there are a lot of lights out there. There are a lot of stars, and they're all fixed relative to each other. There are a lot of stars. The sky, of course, was black. There are a lot of stars.
And we could not see stars.
I've often tried to explain the difference between darkness, when you turn out the lights and it's dark in here, or blackness. Blackness is the endlessness of it all.
You know, there are a lot of lights out there. There are a lot of stars, and they're all fixed relative to each other. There are a lot of stars.
When you're no longer Earthlings, how do you navigate? You can use the stars.
The sky is almost white.
The air conditioning.
What powered the air? Batteries. You had a number of big batteries in the lunar module. They powered pumps, they powered the air conditioning, they powered the communication system, and that's the reason we were only able to stay on the moon 33 hours. Later on, we got a little better batteries, more batteries, and we could stay longer. But batteries turned out to be, for the weight involved, the thing that gave you the power. Now the best.
Anyone got any idea how these bulky 1969 batteries were working on the moon with an average temperature there of 107 degrees Celsius? Me neither.
The rocket engine?
Yeah. Is the engine loud as you're descending?
Yeah, well, the engine is very loud. It's very difficult to tell the difference between feeling sound and hearing sound, but yes, it's loud.
When you were in it, you couldn't hear it in the vacuum of space.
Any ill effects from the Van Allen radiation belts?
No, now I'm not sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen radiation belt. Maybe we did. I don't know the distance to the Van Allen radiation belt, and if we did, it wasn't a problem. If we were going to encounter it, then we would have had to build the spacecraft and the spacesuit to not give humans a problem.
The belts are 1,000 miles to 25,000 miles above the Earth.
Then we went right out through them.
No effects on your cells?
Didn't even know it. I don't think anybody, well, maybe somebody said you went through the radiation belt, but we didn't feel it inside, and we didn't get any, added radiation.
I saw CNN they said that the radiation belts surrounding Earth are more dangerous than previously believed because the astronauts saw shooting stars with their eyes closed. Just when they got within 600.
Radiation belt. We saw shooting stars, but they're not shooting stars from with your eyes closed, although they look like it.
I don't know exactly how far out the radiation Van Allen belt is. It didn't seem to bother us very much.
If you're out in space beyond the Van Allen belt, and probably within the Van Allen belt, and close your eyes and just pay attention. You don't notice it unless you pay attention. Then all of a sudden you'll see a little flash like a shooting star, except it's like that. There goes one this way. Then one just blossoms. And then not that fast. Maybe you wait 3 minutes or 2 minutes and one goes whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. That is bullshit. My guess is in Earth orbit, if you closed your eyes and just paid attention, that you would see them. If you'll close your eyes and pay attention, then you see them whistling by.
I encourage you to do the opposite. Open your eyes and you will start to see things in a new way.
Not on our mission, by the way, they hadn't been discovered yet. I saw them one day on the moon. It wasn't dark, and it was kind of dark, and it wasn't dark, and it was kind of dark, and I saw this flash of light, and it looked like it was on the moon, but really it wasn't. It was a flash of light in my eye.
Huh, really? Now, on the way to the moon, we did conduct lots. We weren't passengers away to the moon.
We're passengers. We're guys going on a flight.
Lies! The lies!
Say your name.
My name is Alan Bean.
I swear to God and affirm.
I swear to God and affirm.
Under penalty of perjury.
Under penalty of perjury.
Treason.
Treason? No, not treason. Treason has nothing to do with it. What's treasonous?
That's doing something fraudulent to the taxpayers.
That's crap.
Well, what
that
about
isn't treason.
Under penalty of eternal damnation?
Under penalty of eternal damnation.
And under penalty of treason?
Treason is when you sell out your country.
Well, if you used $135 billion to not go to the moon.
That's still not treason. That's still not treason. I've said enough. It just happens to be a lie, that's all.
Nothing
happened. There was no great unknowns, no science fiction going to the moon. It was all science fact, although sometimes it seemed like it was science fiction.
Landing. You know, there's so many theories out there. There's diehard people either way, Scott. You got some that say, yeah, we landed there, I got proof. And then you have some, like yourself, saying, no, we didn't land there, I have proof. So tonight we're going to try and throw all this out on the table and get the feedback from the audience. You know, put it in chat. Let us know your opinions. They're all respected here, folks, all opinions. But Scott, you know, you've been researching this for years. And
yes, I have. Thing is when you're researching something like this and you're listening to NASA and their other representatives, they try to discourage you from looking further into the subject. They're trying to blind you with science. They try to tell you that you're not smart enough to understand it. And I find that quite disturbing that they would do something like that. Like when the initial people were coming up with this, the original researchers, it's pretty amazing what they were doing because they were working alone. Like there was no communication like you had today.
Mm-hmm.
You were taking their own personal knowledge, like Marcus Allen, right, his knowledge of the cameras, and he looked at the story that NASA is saying, and then he's going, how did these things work? How do they work in that environment? So then he researches to see the modifications they made, and the modifications were quite simply to allow them to operate the cameras with the suits, so they could clip them on the front of the suits. They put a trigger on it so they could use it with the gloves, but there was no modifications made for the environment. And of course, when he asked them, they won't respond.
Go figure.
They simply won't give him the answer. They won't give him the thing. But they actually did respond because they initially took the information and made it disappear. They say, oh, we lost it, right? So for years, they're saying we lost it. Even Ron Howard couldn't get any of the videos, right?
Right.
Well, miraculously, all those videos are back online. You can find them on YouTube. They're just flooding the market with it now. And like I said, they're trying to just blind you with science. They're trying to just overload everything. They put 10,000 pieces on Flickr, right, of photos out there. And they say, here's the puzzle, you put it together. Well, I put it together. It doesn't state what they say it is. It is a little more defined. It's more like what Gus Grissom wanted to say. And the astronauts that documented that.
But they kept him quiet.
They did it for him. Well, they couldn't do it in public. They lost 3 of their friends. They couldn't go to the media. They couldn't do it in front of the camera. But when they got behind the camera, they started to document everything. And of course, nobody could really see what they were doing. They couldn't walk out on the set. They couldn't have other footprints out there. These guys were fairly much alone with those cameras. And what they did with those cameras is they showed how the sets were built, where it was located. They showed and documented all of the equipment that they were using, carefully documented it through each of the 6 missions. And if you look at it, it's the same equipment. Like if you're going to stage it 6 times, fake it 6 times, you don't need 6 landers. You only need 1 experimental package, and you only need 1 rover. Unless it breaks down, you have to get another one out. And that's exactly what they did. And they documented every bit of it. If you're looking at the photos, the ones that I sent you, you can see the equipment aging with time. They didn't even bother to put it away. I mean, over 2.5 years, they left it laying outside. It gets rained on, the sun bakes it, and you can see the stuff age. The seismic experiment, which is just a large foil sitting on the ground, I sent you 1 shot, and it's showing that the dirt has caked back after it rained on it, and there's mold around the edge of it. And then the next shot I sent you is the next mission, and the stuff is all dried and cracked, the foil splitting back.
What we're going to do, Scott, we're going to bring Marcus in here in a minute. We're going to have both of you guys on, and we're going to put all this information out there because this is very important, and a lot of people out there are wondering, of course, did we land on the moon? Some, like I said, they're die hard with it. But what I'd like to do is start from literally the ground up. And technology back then, you're talking the 60s. Technology, nothing like it is today. But in your opinion, did we have the technology itself in these rockets, in these vehicles, to even get to the moon?
Just consider the computers, the guidance system on the computer. They're traveling about 400 times faster than the vehicle. They only made 3 adjustments in 238,000 miles, and the accuracy of the computer would have to be faster than what a new Tesla is, right? Consider the speed it's traveling at and the accuracy when it's only going to make 3 corrections over that period, like 1 a day. It's only going to make 1 adjustment a day. How accurate does that thing have to be? And they're checking it with the sextant against the stars. It's almost impossible today to do it because you're free from Earth, so now you're on your own. If you match it to the Earth, you have to calculate the speed it's moving at. If you point it at the moon, you have to estimate where it's going to be and where you are, and then you have to take in the gravitational pull as it declines from the Earth, and as it increases to the moon, and then the side pull from the sun. All of those calculations have to be put in there.
And they have to be perfect. They have to be,
perfect.
Like they say, it has to be a perfect blend, a perfect mixture.
And they only had enough fuel to make 3 adjustments on the way. If they messed up on one, they're going to shoot right on by it.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Of course, joining us as well, Marcus Allen. Welcome back to the show, Marcus. Great to have you.
Thanks very much, Todd. Good to be here. Sorry to be a bit late.
Oh, my
Better late than never.
Don't worry, you guys are across the pond. We understand.
It's 2:30 in the morning over here, so it's nice and quiet and we can concentrate.
It's a little late. It's a little late. Of course, we got Scott Henderson joining us here. Phil, of course, is on here, and we're discussing this lunar landing. And Scott, what I wanted to do is just have both you guys on so we can get all the information out to the audience so they can form their opinion. Because like I was telling Scott, there's a lot of people out there that are real headstrong that we went to the moon, and some are real headstrong that we didn't or couldn't. So that's what we're kind of doing, and we're breaking it down from the ground up, from liftoff to landing, and trying to dissect this because I'm curious and I'm on the fence. You know, I'm not going to say yes or no either way, but I'm on the fence about this. And what do you think so far, Phil?
Well, one of the first questions I have, and this is going to the very beginning, if they left this stuff sitting out where the elements, the weather got to it and everything, did NASA really think people were so stupid that they wouldn't notice these things eventually?
What, you mean when they took all those photographs?
If they left this stuff sitting out and it aged, it got mold on it, it rusted, things like that, they didn't think sooner or later people are going to see these pictures and say, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Did they just underestimate the intelligence of the American people, or?
People weren't supposed to see these 50 years later, 48 years later, right?
Whoops.
I mean, they took thousands of photographs. What, they used maybe 3 dozen photos for each mission for media purposes? I mean, even the people that were looking at them would have just quickly shot through and say, oh, we need one of the lander, one of the flag, you know, saluting the flag, this and that, a couple of the rover. The rest of them were just there. They would have just been archived. Right? And if they did see them like that, they would have set them aside. They said, we're not going to use that.
And this is where it gets interesting, because we weren't supposed to see these photos, but yet the government technically has to release them to the public. And now that they're released, NASA and, of course, the government makes us look like idiots that we don't understand the whole concept of it.
If I can just come in here, on these photographs, this is an area I've studied quite extensively. When I first started looking at the Apollo photographs, the only ones I could find were published in books and encyclopedias and biographies, stories by astronauts. When I tried to buy some photographs, I had to go to an astronomy show and get a set of postcards, 6 postcards, which are the classic images from Apollo 11, you know, coming down the ladder, standing on the moon. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until the early 2000s, or maybe the late 1990s, that because of the introduction of the internet and the web, NASA were being forced to put their photographic archive online. Prior to that, very few people even knew how many existed. We were told but until about 20 years ago at the most, these photographs were just not available. They weren't being hidden or anything, they were just very hard to find. You had to write to NASA. I remember writing letters. Oh, yeah. You had to write to NASA and say, please could you send me some photographs? I'd like them from Apollo 11. And NASA, if they were feeling particularly good, they'd reply in about several months later and send you a couple of pictures, say, you know, these are the ones that we have available. They just weren't available. So Scott is quite right to say that these photographs are just have not been seen. It's only since the internet, and there are various websites, in fact there are almost too many now, there are 4 that I know of, where you've got the whole Apollo record, and there are 32,000 images taken after the craft had been launched and before it came back again. There were many hundreds of thousands of all the operations that were going on. So it's only very recently that we've been able to examine them. The camera doesn't lie. The camera tells a story. And the story that we see in these photographs is what NASA wanted us to see. Man on the moon. So when you see a photograph with a black sky, you know it couldn't have been taken on Earth. It had to have been taken on the moon. And so you immediately make the assumption, oh, well, this is on the moon. Couldn't have been taken anywhere else because it's got a black sky. Mm-hmm. Photoshop wasn't developed and sold to the public until the early 1990s. But film studios were perfectly capable of manipulating images. And we saw that on film. I mean, there are many photographic anomalies in films, but we accept them because we know what we're looking at. This is being held up as real life. I claim it's not. I claim it's a fabrication. Because once you start looking at the photographs and examining them in detail, Scott has mentioned a few of the details that he's identified. Many other people have identified many other anomalies in the photograph. You have to be able to read a photograph in the same way that we read a book. Look, there are 26 letters in the alphabet, and they're all made of little squiggles. When we read a book of 50,000 words, there are probably many, many duplicated words, but we know the context in which the word is used. Therefore, we can make sense of what we're reading. And our brains are so clever that we can identify what these little squiggles are, because they're letters of the alphabet and they make words, and we understand the words, so we know the context, we know the meaning. If you look at a photograph, you normally just look at it as a two-dimensional image, and you see the images in it. If you examine it technically, and you look at the perspective in the photograph, you look at the optics that would have been used to create that image, you look at the light levels, the direction of the light, and you look at the focus. Quite often in photographs, you'll see photographs that have part of it is out of focus. So that will tell you what type of lens is being used. If you can read a photograph, you can then start to deconstruct it. And once you start to read the photograph, and I've been technically trained as a photographer, I know what cameras can and cannot do. I know what film can record. And I found so many anomalies and unexplained details in these photographs that it makes me wonder if we have been seriously misled to the fact that what most people will support, that they believe that man has landed on the moon. I believe in three things: Father Christmas, the Tooth Fairy, and the Easter Bunny.
And these are things, yeah, I mean, a lot of people will say that the wool has been pulled over our eyes. I mean, you're talking back in the 60s, the big space race, the Cold War was going on. We had to beat Russia to the moon. I mean, everybody knows that, or anybody that wants to know that knows that.
No, the slight correction there, we had to be seen to beat Russia to the moon.
Okay, well said, good point. Good point. And that is what the country is wrapped around. Now, this is something that, a lot of people take this as a disrespect to the United States, and it's not. This is an opinion, people. This is a theory. This is proof that, just like Scott and Marcus have said, has not been available to us until recently. So what's important is that we do talk about it. Don't be afraid to talk about it. Don't think, oh my goodness, I'm not a good U.S. citizen even thinking this. Don't think that. That's what they want you to think. Don't think that. Now, both Scott and Marcus, they are out of the country. Okay, so they have an unbiased opinion here, which is good.
Was there ever a time when the Soviet Union questioned the validity of the moon landings? Because they were our biggest competition.
Well, let's put it this way. Soviet physicists, Soviet scientists, Soviet filmmakers have questioned the Apollo moon landings, but only recently. Until the until the Iron Curtain came down and the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, there was no real access to Russian citizens to the information that we have available to us in what was known as the West. Since the advent of the internet, anybody interested can now access the same information you, I, Scott, and anybody else can access. And they have examined it, and they have reported on many of the discrepancies, specifically to do with the Saturn V rocket. They can't work out how on earth that thing got off the ground, let alone did what it was claimed to have done. And there are many anomalies about the Saturn V rocket, not least of which are the engines that we're told were used on it. Russian filmmakers have also recreated that famous Mythbusters program where the Mythbusters, Adam and Jamie, got together to prove we'd been to the moon because they could show it on a tabletop model. And the Russian filmmakers decided that they would try to replicate that particular episode.
Okay.
And found that the only way that they could replicate what Adam and Jamie had achieved in showing that the light was certainly going to be reflecting onto the astronaut, in this case Buzz Aldrin, as he came down the ladder of the lunar lander, the Eagle, was by wearing white coats instead of black, which you would expect in a film studio. The only way they could achieve the reflection on Buzz Aldrin was by wearing white coats. So they demonstrated that the only way that Adam and Jamie, the Mythbusters, could have done it was by doing the same thing, i.e. faking it, which is a bit sad, really, because they had a good reputation for scientific entertainment, which is basically what they said the program was. It wasn't science, it was entertainment. So the answer to the question is yes. Many Russians have now started to question it. I've actually appeared on Russian television, on Channel 1 in Russia. Speaking in English, they dubbed me, so I don't know exactly what it was they told me I was saying, describing problems with the Apollo moon landings. It was about a 10-minute sequence. Apparently it's a highly rated program in Russia, and I'm told that Vladimir Putin watches these programs occasionally. So there are questions being raised. As if it was so easy to go to the moon in the 1960s, and we launched 9 missions into lunar orbit. Why haven't we been back in 50 years? What's the problem?
Todd and I were just talking about that before the show, that if they could do this in '69, later on with the space shuttles and everything they created, how come we never went back to the moon again?
There is a very good answer to that, which maybe we'll come on to in just a minute. But that question, why haven't we been back, is being asked with increasing regularity. Just to put it into context, in 1492, Christopher Columbus arrived in America. 30 years later, Spain, which is where he came from, Spain had taken control of Central America and were spreading their propaganda all over South America. In 1770, Captain James Cook from the UK arrived in Australia and claimed it for Britain, as opposed to the Dutch who had been there a bit earlier. But James Cook arrived in 1770. Within 30 years, Britain started to ship its prison population out there. In 1969, man lands on the moon. 49 years later, nobody's been anywhere near the place. That's not the way human society works. We always want to find out what's around the next corner, what's down the end of the river, what's over the mountain. We're explorers. We started the exploration of space. Human space exploration, it's called. Since then, the only exploration of space has been 200 miles up on the International Space Station, which we go to on a regular basis. And how do we get there? We get there on Russian rockets. What an irony is that?
That is just wicked. And you'd think by now the United States, the way we work is by now we'd be digging to the center of the moon to see what's in it. No one's done anything like that. There's no drilling that we know of. And, it's like we have not been back. So, yes, I definitely follow that and find that very strange that we have not been back. But the thing is, Marcus, Scott, I want to get both your opinions on this before we, go to the news break here. But getting there, here we are. We've left the Earth's atmosphere. And back then, we're in this craft. Now, you have certain aspects in space that obviously will kill us instantly here on Earth, and our atmosphere protects us from that. Those are solar particles, meteorites, things like that, radiation itself. Now that we've lifted off, we're floating into space, we're out of the Earth's atmosphere, could the astronauts, we'll start with you, Marcus, could they survive an actual voyage from here to the moon?
No, they couldn't. They couldn't, because they were not protected from radiation. Now, there are many arguments for and against radiation. Some people will say that radiation is not nearly as intense as it's being made out to be. And you mentioned the Van Allen radiation belts. They're named after Professor James Van Allen, who was the first scientist in 1958 to identify them. And he confirmed their existence by sending a Geiger counter on one of the first rockets that were launched, Explorer 1, 1958. Unfortunately, the Geiger counter stopped working. It started showing a record, it stopped working. And they couldn't work out why it had stopped working. until they got the thing back down again and discovered that the radiation was so intense and so severe that it had basically destroyed the Geiger counter. So what they had to do to actually measure the radiation levels, they sent another Geiger counter up on Explorer 4, but this one, guess what, was protected by lead shielding to prevent the overload. Well, if they knew that the radiation was so severe that a Geiger counter had to be protected, man, who is far more susceptible to radiation damage, it affects the DNA and the cells, and that's why it will eventually kill you. That man is much more susceptible to these levels of radiation, but it seems to have been completely taken out of the discussion, and NASA will not address it. I made the possible mistake of saying that, if these spacesuits, which are obviously protecting the astronauts because they've been to the moon and they were all still healthy, well, they were at the time, could the same spacesuits be used to go into Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and now Fukushima and clear up the mess? Because radiation is radiation.
Right.
And the manufacturers of the spacesuit, the International Latex Corporation, said, we don't advise that. There was no radiation protection supplied in the spacesuits. We built them according to the specification that NASA supplied us with. So if the spacesuits couldn't protect the astronauts from radiation, either they did not go where we were told they went, because if they had, they would all have been dead.
Right.
And having a dead astronaut live on television is not exactly what NASA wanted to promote human space travel.
That's a huge risk.
It was an enormous risk. And it's still, have you seen pictures of astronauts returning from the International Space Station after 6 months in orbit? They can't stand up. They have to be carried away. They have to be carried out of their craft. Right, they recover. It's to do with muscle wastage. It's to do with microgravity or zero gravity.
These are things that NASA doesn't want us to know. And Scott, what's your opinion on the radiation, real quick? We got a couple of minutes here. What's your take on this? Do you agree with Marcus?
Let's assume that we follow NASA's story and say that the spacecraft had sufficient radiation protection, and let's say that the space suits had protection. And it only took an hour to go through the Van Allen belts and everything was fine. Well, what happened on the 3 days on the way back is completely different, because they came back into the craft with radioactive dirt all over their suits, got out of them. They're in zero gravity, and this stuff is just floating around inside that craft with all three of them. And on top of that, they put 100 kilos of radioactive rocks in there with them. What do you think happened to them on the way back? There was no protection then. You're fully exposed to it for 3 solid days on the way back.
These are the things people don't think about, that they took those suits off, they had the helmets off.
Zero gravity, the dust won't settle. And it's not dust, it's dirt. They'll be breathing it in as well.
And according to them, it's very fine, powdery dirt, almost like powdered sugar. It's not really heavy. So that is going to be definitely airborne, floating around the capsule, the craft, whatever it is, to protect them from radiation, which radiation knows zero boundaries. Even lead itself, has its limitations with it. But something like that.
They acknowledge that radiation is absorbed over time. There's 72 hours right there.
Yeah. And that is full-on exposure. There's no, So this is where, it definitely raised an eyebrow when I was, talking with you, of course, having Marcus on last time. It definitely raised an eyebrow with me on, did we really land there? Let's get into some photographic evidence. Now, one that I have in mind, and one that's posted there in chat right now, and I'm going to try and paint a picture of this the best I can on radio. It's just the astronaut is on the moon, okay, supposedly, and there's a white box, and it has what some of you may call a shadow, but what others, and I think Scott's going to explain here, that this is mold. And being on the moon, it has no atmosphere, therefore no humidity or anything of that nature, no moisture. How could mold form on something with no atmosphere? You want to explain that, Scott?
Oh, that's Apollo 12 where he's setting up the equipment. That is supposed to be the central station for the experimental package that he's setting up there. Now, if you follow NASA's story, I mean, they prepared all this stuff in a clean room, put it in a spacecraft and sent it there, and this is what it looks like when it comes out. You can clearly see the mold underneath it. I mean, this stuff was just between Apollo 11 and Apollo 12. They didn't even put the stuff away. They just left it outside on the set. It's as simple as that. I mean, and it's documented everywhere. It's not like one or two photos. There's literally thousands of them like this. And the astronauts themselves clearly documented it. That's what they were doing with the cameras. As a matter of fact, it's the only thing they were doing with the cameras. Like the experimental package, I mean, once you set it up, it's a very important piece of scientific equipment as far as NASA says. Wouldn't they be running tests on it, making sure that it's going to be working perfectly before they left the moon?
Okay, so this is an obvious blooper that NASA did not intend for our eyes to see.
Well, even if they saw it, they just would have shuffled it aside. And then 25 years later, they're under pressure to put the photos out. There's nobody left working at NASA from 1969. And the people that work at NASA believe that they went. So anything that says Apollo, let's just put it up.
This particular picture where it's a close-up and you can see that mold, that picture was never supposed to get out.
I just cut and blew it up. But, I mean, you can go right to the Apollo Journal site right at NASA and pull the same picture up and see that it hasn't been messed with. All of these came from that site. They're all off of NASA's official site, the Apollo Archive site.
Okay, I'm just playing devil's advocate here a little bit. I can't believe that NASA would be that sloppy with things, that they would let these kind of things go by.
It's everywhere.
And they never thought anybody would see this?
It's everywhere. Even the shot of the rover sitting there, nice, beautiful close-up shot of the Apollo 17 rover, the rear axle has an oil leak. Well, there's no liquids in space. All over it, the mud's stuck all over it, right?
These are the little things. And I know a lot of you listening, I know you may be in denial, but definitely trying to listen to both sides here. That's what's important. Because this is information, this is photographic evidence, this is, you know, these guys have been researching the Apollo missions and landings for years, decades. So they definitely know what they're talking about. And they have an unbiased opinion, okay, which is important as well. Looking at the mold itself, I mean, those of you that are in chat, you could see it. We all know what mold looks like, moisture. You know, it kind of grows up on things, and there's a greenish tint to it. And, you know, those thinking, okay, this is just a shadow. Well, look at the device itself, that piece of equipment that this is on. You could see the astronaut's shadow or some shadow on there. And that's obviously, the mold stands out from that shadow. The shadow doesn't cover it. The mold stands out from it. And it definitely looks like somebody laid that in something wet and just kind of, you know, used it last minute kind of thing. Because
that's right. Just left from one mission to the other, and the astronauts documented that. They're the ones that took the pictures, and they're the ones that want you to see it.
And with the Apollo missions, you know, Marcus, the astronauts themselves, everything, NASA, everything was perfect. Everything had to be perfect. The atmosphere, the you know, all the calculations, the gimbals, and all this stuff had to be absolutely perfect for this mission to be a success. How can they get away with this, though, Marcus? That's what's blowing my mind.
They would get away with it because people like Scott, who's done some remarkable research into the detail of the photographs, people like Scott weren't expected 50 years after it all happened to spend the hundreds of hours that he has spent looking at these photographs. There was just no concept that somebody would do that. Apollo happened, 60s, early 1970s. As Scott said very accurately, there's nobody working at NASA now who was working at NASA during Apollo, because they'd be far too old. They've retired. They may have worked there for 30, 40 years, but there were very, very, very few people. NASA have moved on to other things. NASA are basically an agency, a part of the Department of Defense. there were many shuttle missions that we never heard a thing about because they were launching military satellites. So the idea that you can't keep a secret is complete rubbish. Of course you can keep a secret. People in NASA didn't need to keep the secret. They were doing the job they were employed to do. They didn't need to know what was happening over at Edwards Air Force Base and Vandenberg Air Force Base when the shuttle was being launched from there with the satellites on board. Now, there's an interesting point about this. That this has only very recently come to light. There's something called the keyhole satellites, which are spy satellites in effect. They've been up there for several years now. The current one is keyhole 12. And they're the ones that take the photographs. You know, you can read a newspaper headline from space and all that. They're the ones that do that. That's why you can read the car number plates from space. When the first space shuttle was launched, the Columbia, was launched in 1981, there was a very big fear that some of the heat shield tiles had been loosened on launch and wouldn't protect the craft on its return. Now, there were 4 astronauts on board at the time. There was a real problem. How would NASA find out if the space shuttle had been damaged on launch, which we know happened on the Challenger mission when a piece of ice fell off and hit the space shuttle? On the first launch, the inaugural launch in 1981, 9 years after Apollo had finished, they found that they could orbit the space shuttle at a certain altitude so that it could be photographed in space by the hexagon spy satellite. If that could be maneuvered out of its polar orbit, which is what it was in, it would meet the space shuttle on one orbit, and it was able to get into position to photograph the space shuttle as it orbited 17,500 miles an hour. It could photograph it so that the photographs could then be transmitted back to Earth, and the scientists could have a look at the photographs to see if the space shuttle heat shield tiles had been damaged to the extent that it would endanger the shuttle on its re-entry. Very few people even knew this had happened, let alone the information. That's only come out in the last 2 to 3 years. So a great deal of secrecy surrounds NASA and surrounds their activities. They don't tell us everything that's going on. We think that because they're a civilian organization, that they're going to operate for the best and for the future benefit of mankind. Right. Yes, in some cases they do. So one has to take into account their secrecy, which is basically the military secrecy that they operate under. And that's what the astronauts were. They were all military men. They were under military orders. Their oaths of secrecy was such that they would not let each other down. Even now, even 50 years after the event, no astronaut is going to break ranks. It's going to take the diligent research of people like Scott, and there are many others around the world who are doing similar research, to find out the truth about Apollo. Because until we find the truth of Apollo and find out how limited it actually was, human space travel will be limited by the refusal of NASA to confront its past. And that's all we ask them to do, to confront their past, admit their position, so that we can now all move forward, because there are many exciting things happening in space. The Apollo legacy is holding us all back. It's a tragedy. So anybody who works for NASA who's listening to this, please do your duty and confront the Apollo legacy, because until you do, your function as a space scientist is severely limited. So anybody who works for NASA who's listening to this, please do your duty and confront the Apollo legacy, because until you do, your function as a space scientist is severely limited.
What happened with Apollo 13?
Oh, that was a wonderful piece of space opera. Wonderful piece of script writing. It followed the rather unfortunate event on Apollo 12, where the camera was pointed directly at the sun. It burned the lens out, so nobody could see what was going on. So everybody lost interest. And when I Love Lucy got cancelled, everybody complained. So that's a problem. Their PR was definitely not working. So they decided to operate a space rescue mission.
In theory, arrived at the moon, the landing. Now, the moon's a very tranquil place. There's obviously no atmosphere, no gravity, or little gravity. I think there's a tad. But could the craft have landed on the surface? Is it capable of accepting something like that without any kind of major disaster?
It's highly unlikely. There is a small amount of gravity, as you say, on the moon, about 1/6 the amount of gravity we have here on Earth. So there is gravity there. Things do get pulled down onto the surface. When you're orbiting the moon, you're going to be orbiting at about 6,000 miles an hour. If you're going to land on the moon, you've got to come to a standstill. So the way you do that is you fire your rocket to slow you down. You retro-fire it. You fire it in the direction you're traveling. It will slow you down. You will then come, after a couple of orbits of slowing down, you will hover over the lunar surface with your rocket still firing because it's got to counteract the small amount of gravity, and you will lower yourself onto the lunar surface. Two things here. If you're firing your rocket, it's going to be producing a certain amount of exhaust which will disturb the lunar surface, and we know the lunar surface from the photographs is obviously very dusty and very lightly covered. It's not thick dust, it's quite secure because they've already landed craft on the moon to discover that there wasn't 6 feet of dust into which you would sink. So they landed on the lunar surface. Very little dust is seen to be disturbed, which is the first anomaly. Because if you're looking at the photographs of the landers, the foot pads, which are relatively close to the exhaust, which is firing up until almost the moment that the thing hits the ground or touches the ground, you would expect the pads to show a little bit of dust having settled in them. It's a logical conclusion to reach. Any unmanned craft you see, the Surveyor craft on the moon and the Curiosity craft on Mars, shows dust on the craft after it's landed. So why isn't it on Apollo? That's another anomaly. All these things that just don't quite add up, and you start looking for other anomalies. When you've got a craft landed on the lunar surface, it's landed in a way that we can't do here on Earth. You can't land a rocket. Well, say you couldn't until a couple of years ago, when Elon Musk in SpaceX decided that rather than chuck the large booster rockets away, he would land them back on Earth by retro-firing the rocket and landing. We've seen the pictures of that. Those are quite real. It's a great achievement to have done it. On the moon, nobody had ever achieved this. Neil Armstrong was practicing in what's called the flying bedstead, which he managed to crash. Fortunately, he ejected. The real anomaly is that Buzz Aldrin in Apollo 11 and all the lunar module pilots in the other 6 missions that supposedly landed on the moon were not trained to land the craft. In Apollo 11, only Armstrong had been trained to land the craft. Supposing he'd been incapacitated, Aldrin would have died as well because the craft would have crashed. Why wasn't he trained? He said it in so many words. He said, I wasn't trained to land it. I didn't know what to do.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And that's something, I mean, let's face it, NASA always preaches they have backups for backups for backups. There's no backup there. That's a good point.
Absolutely no backup. And also, there's no rescue possible either. They would have been dead.
Aldrin was named the LMP, Lunar Module Pilot, right? He couldn't fly it.
Exactly. They couldn't fly it. So, I mean, how many times have you flown in an aircraft? And if you were told that the co-pilot couldn't land the thing, would you even get on it? I think it's highly unlikely. Of course you could fly it. Why they have 2 pilots on a plane? One eats a piece of rotten fish or something.
These are things that we do not think about because we assume, which we all know what you break down assume, we know what that means. We assume and we trust NASA to have all their ducks in a row. This is something that I didn't even think about that. I mean, somebody's named as a pilot and they have no idea how to fly the damn thing. It just blows my mind. And that's just that's just a small thing. Scott, the moon surface itself, let's discuss, some of this with the photographs.
You're looking at a simulation entirely, so that's not the lunar surface you're looking at. That's a landfill site that they covered over. It's actually a scrap metal site that they have covered over.
Let's get into some detail.
And I believe that it's on the south side of Cinder Lake, just north of Flagstaff in Arizona. And that's why you see the cars, that's why you see the pieces of metal sticking up, that's why you see the rocket engines. I put a picture up of a nose cone of a missile that they propped up just to stage it. They put it right up on top of some rocks. They show you how they built the rocks and how they put the modeling clay, they sprayed the modeling clay on and then shot the dirt over top of it. That's what's in the photographs.
Okay, well, I was wondering too. I can't remember. I'm old enough to remember watching the moon landings. Did they ever set a camera up? Did they ever have film of the lunar module taking off?
Yes, it did. They missed it on 15 with the explosive bolts that separate the descent and the ascent modules. You see the explosive bolts go off, and then there's no exhaust thrust. No visible exhaust at all. But on Apollo 16, the astronauts put a chunk of that explosive bolts in there and blew the whole side of the craft off. The 4 panels come off. If you watch it even at normal speed on the Apollo 16 liftoff, you see the panels come off. And then go take a look at the photo on Apollo 17. They replaced the 4 panels, but they're lighter color now. They're using the same piece of equipment over and over again. It's just as simple as that.
Okay, so here we are. You know, we're on the supposed lunar surface or the desert in Arizona, and there's some photographs here that we're posting in chat for everybody to see. I'll try and describe these the best I can. With this, this one shows the lunar vehicle with the astronauts sitting in there, and then it has this close-up of a mound of rock or dirt, and then there it looks like a stick. It almost looks like an egg beater or a whisk on the end of it.
Oh, that's the grasping tongs, and the rover's sitting on 3 wheels. One's off the ground.
I see that. It's floating. Okay? It's literally
and
floating.
What struck me about this picture, this pile of dirt looks like it was put on there by a front-end loader. And it really struck me because it's the only feature like that in all the thousands of photographs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't understand exactly what it was, so I put this on my desktop, and when I was walking by my computer, I looked at the shadow of the grasping tongs, and it makes an arrow. And when you get down to the end of the arrow, there's an astronaut's glove buried in the dirt. And when you look at the rest of it, it's a whole pile of gloves. They're just covered over with dirt. You can see the 4 fingers sticking out all over the place.
Oh my goodness.
It's completely staged, which means that the people that did the set were involved in it, and the astronauts were involved in it, and the photographers were involved in it.
You could see this, and one thing, correct me if I'm wrong.
I gave you a close-up of the glove at the end of the arrow. I mean, it might have only taken 30 years if they had used a neon sign. Like, that's about a 3-foot arrow shadow. And when you realize that they're pointing it out, and I've got other pictures with the tongs where they're pointing out different things on the rock. The other rock that they made is just plastered over a wire cage. And I showed a shot of the close-up of the wire cage through the hole, which is just down and below the right of the thing. That's the same everywhere. They use the gnome, they use their feet, they point everywhere to stuff. Each astronaut, each mission has a slightly different style of how they show you this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But they literally dig it up and show it to you. And that's the only thing they're doing.
It's like their own little code that they're, doing to kind of get it out yet not get it out. And
that's right.
And
but
one of the
you can
things
imagine what they were doing when 3 of their friends died. They wanted to document this. And it's the only thing they're doing with those cameras. And it's consistent for all 6 missions over 2.5 years. They didn't fade on their mission one bit.
In your opinion, how have we done since 1957?
Well, I think NASA unfortunately became the agency to nowhere. It just spun wheels, went around the planet Earth. The space station was supposed to be the gateway for Mars and the planets, and that became a big turkey in outer space. So I think we've been basically spinning wheels for 50 years.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
The space station will be our gateway to the universe, our foothold in outer space, the keystone of our space program. With it as our base camp, we will be able to reach the planets and perhaps one day to the stars.
What are the experiments that are being conducted geared towards future, longer space travel and exploration?
A lot of the experiments we're doing up here really directly relate to those long duration missions that will take us beyond low Earth orbit, beyond low Earth orbit. Q, Mark.
The time has come to look beyond brief encounters. We must commit ourselves anew to a sustained program of manned exploration of the solar system, and yes, the permanent settlement of space. Back to the moon, back to the future, and this time back to stay. The Space Council will report back to me as soon as possible with concrete recommendations to chart a new and continuing course to the moon and Mars and beyond. And now we're going to sign this proclamation.
It took us 8 years to get to the moon the first time, 50 years ago, when we had never done it before. You know, after years of cost overruns and slipped deadlines, we're actually being told that the earliest we can get back to the moon is 2028.
NASA came in with a vacuum-packed
glass enclosed moon rock that was taken off the moon in 1969. It's 3.6 billion years old. I mean, I may be wrong about it, but that's what I think.
Good morning, I'm Steve Inskeep. A prized possession in the Dutch National Museum is not what the curators thought. Back in 1969, the Apollo 11 astronauts visited the Netherlands, and the U.S. ambassador gave the Dutch Prime Minister what he said was a moon rock. No doubt it gave a warm feeling to the U.S. ally. But when an expert saw it in the National Museum, he said he wasn't so sure it was real. Geologists have now identified the moon rock as petrified wood.
In the past 30 years, no human being has set foot on another world or ventured farther upward into space than 386 miles. Today, I announce a new plan to explore space and extend a human presence across our solar system. Using the Crew Exploration Vehicle, we will undertake extended human missions to the moon as early as 2015. With the experience and knowledge gained on the moon, we will then be ready to take the next steps of space exploration, human missions to Mars and to worlds beyond.
Two words, the moon. This is the key focus of the fiscal 2020 budget being proposed by the Civil Space Agency today. Now, according to NASA Administrator Jim Bridenstine, quote, "We will go to the moon in the next decade with innovative new technologies and systems to explore more locations across the lunar surface than ever before." A series of small delivery missions this year. Then we've got new landers expected, robots eventually, according to NASA, humans by 2028.
The moon was 50 years ago. What's been the delay? The moon was 50 years ago. What's been the delay?
I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. May, when much to my surprise.
So, yes, the moon was like 50 years ago, and why haven't we, essentially colonized it up until now?
Hippity hoppity, hippity hopping over hill and dale. Da 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 da. Hippity hopping along.
Nobody is more committed to manned spaceflight, to human exploration of space, than I am. But we've got to do it in a smart way. And unlike the previous program, we are setting a course with specific and achievable milestones. Early in the next decade, a set of crewed flights will test and prove the systems required for exploration beyond low Earth orbit.
After spending more than 45 years in low Earth orbit, President Trump and our entire administration believe that it is time to push onward to new horizons and new destinations.
Today, NASA is essentially trapped in low Earth orbit.
If NASA is not currently capable of landing American astronauts on the moon in 5 years, we need to change the organization, not the mission.
Today, NASA is essentially trapped in low Earth orbit.
And if commercial rockets are the only way to get American astronauts to the moon in the next 5 years, then commercial rockets it will be.
Today, NASA is essentially trapped in low Earth orbit.
And in December, I signed a historic directive that will return Americans to the moon for the first time since 1972, if you can believe that. For the first time since 1972, if you can believe that. can believe that.
It's time to go. There is no pain, you are receding. A distant ship, smoke on the horizon. You are only coming through in waves. Your lips move, but I can't hear what you say. When I was a child, I caught a fleeting glimpse out of the corner of my eye.
Hey, Globey, I wonder when the ISS is going to pass over my head.
I smoke weed. Weed don't make you do that. What the?
That next giant leap is to return American astronauts to the moon within the next 5 years, by any means necessary.
We did it all with models out in the desert that really wasn't real. We had faked the whole thing.
Dr. von Braun believed it would take what he called, in his words, enabling technology for us to return to the lunar surface.
Today, we know you're not flat. You're a sphere.
The Washington Post went out and did a survey, and here were the results. It said that 20 million Americans said that it was possible that man never landed on the moon. There's actually a group called the Flat Earth Research Society International. It was quoted in this article.
Yeah, they made me a lifetime member of the Flat Earth Society.
We'd like to offer the upholders of this status quo viewpoint yet another major challenge. In Western Australia, during the live telecast of Apollo 11 in 1969, many viewers in that region of Australia, including Una Ronald, were to have an extraordinary experience.
When this moon landing was in the offing, I for one decided to stay up to watch the live telecast, and I did, and we saw a lot of activity on the television screen from the control center, a lot of anticipation, a lot of excitement.
But before we get to what happens next, we need to know how the TV coverage of Apollo 11 was supposed to have reached our screens.
Just shortly before Armstrong stepped on the moon, you can actually see the switch take place where it goes from this stark black and white to a little better. And they stayed with the television signal from Honeysuckle Creek. So when Armstrong stepped on the surface of the moon, it actually came through Australia, but at the time it was reported as being through Goldstone. The voice came through Goldstone, but the TV pictures came from Australia.
It appears that correct information was apparently withheld at the time as to what was supposed to be happening with Apollo 11's reception.
But as I watched this person walking, a Coke bottle in the lower right quadrant of the screen, it seemed to be kicked over and rolled across. And for me, that was just astounding, and I exclaimed aloud at the time, "It's a fake, it's a setup, they're not on the moon at all, look at this, it's a Coke bottle." And they were going to broadcast the same film again in the morning, and I phoned several of my friends, "Did you watch?" And they hadn't, but they were going to watch in the morning. And I waited, of course, to say, "Well, did you see it?" But it didn't happen. I watched the second telecast. There was no Coke bottle, which led me to believe at the time that it must have been edited out. I was convinced it was fake, but why? Why it should be faked? why such a setup? 2 or 3 others of my acquaintance did see it. Furthermore, there were letters written to the West Australian newspaper. They mentioned the Coke bottle. And I waited for it to brew up. I thought, my goodness, there's going to be a glorious ding-dong here going on about this Coke bottle. But suddenly there was nothing at all. And I presume that those who saw it denied their own senses, as people will do. Began to think, well, they couldn't have seen it, or perhaps it was there and that was okay. They'd thrown some rubbish out of the spacecraft or something like that. It could have been. People will invent all kinds of solutions to what is not explained.
What Una Ronald and her friends did not know was that Western Australia was a special case concerning the reception of the initial Apollo images. Contrary to the procedure for that continent set up by Honeysuckle Creek and Parkes, together with NASA and Australian TV, the Apollo 11 images were neither sent directly to Western Australia via satellite, nor was there a broadband link from Sydney in 1969. These images had to be sent over to Perth from Sydney by other means and then retransmitted locally. So for an engineer in the loop, aware of the hoaxed live TV coverage, there was motive for adding further additions to the scene. Moreover, here was an opportunity for someone in the know to manipulate the material before transmission across Western Australia. What does Una Ronald, who was in Western Australia at the time, think about these attempts at fakery?
When I saw the Coke bottle, for me, the whole moon landing from that point was a fake. It was a setup. And if it was a setup, it must have been filmed somewhere on Earth. And it would have been filmed, to my way of thinking, in America, at some lonely site, or alternatively in a huge indoor set, somewhere where they could be private, be secluded, be able to produce this quite passable picture of someone walking on the moon.
Get the shredder.
You get a subpoena, and after getting the subpoena, you delete 33,000 emails. And then you acid wash them.
Intruders broke into the Pro Búsqueda Association for Missing Children, destroyed 4 of its offices, and set fire to its archives.
According to a top Catholic cardinal in Munich, files that may have contained proof of abuse in the Catholic Church may have been intentionally destroyed.
Yesterday, Halliburton pleaded guilty to destroying evidence in 2010.
Secretary of State John Kerry accused Syria of using chemical weapons against its people and destroying the evidence.
The defense to willful destruction of evidence might be that you lack the intent to get rid of evidence.
Admitted that it had lost the original footage of man's first steps on the moon.
I haven't seen anything that indicates the telemetry data is even in existence, and as I said, even if we had it, we don't have the machines to play it back.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology.
Right, we've been unable to track it down. I mean, we don't know where this telemetry data ended up, and we don't know what path it may have taken. So, unfortunately, I'm afraid I can't really give you much of a clue.
Get the shredder.
Through your career and your writing and your acting, you've inspired so many people to enter the sciences. How do you balance science with science fiction? They're both the same.
50 years ago, we pioneered a path to the moon.
Let's be honest about something. If you ask the average person on the street, did mankind go to the moon, it's highly likely that people would just say, yeah, we went to the moon. And if you ask them how they know or how they can be sure, you'd get answers like, everybody knows we went to the moon, or that's what they taught us in school, or that's what the government says, and why would they lie? But the bottom line is that the average person doesn't know we went to the moon, they believe what somebody told them about going to the moon. If they're honest, they'd have to admit that the extent of their knowledge of any kind of space travel is relegated to simply having faith in what somebody told them about that supposed event. Whether we went to the moon or not is not the point of this video. What's relevant here is that a lot of what people spout as truth is merely a regurgitation of what they've been told over a period of time. Having said that, NASA released a new propaganda video on May 14th entitled, "We Are Going," to further justify its expensive existence. Remember, NASA's budget for fiscal year 2019 is $21.5 billion. It represents about 0.5% of the $4.4 trillion the United States plans to spend this year. Since its inception, the United States has spent $601.31 billion on NASA alone. That means NASA costs taxpayers almost $60 million, guys, every single day. Among other heartbreaking problems in America, there are 554,000 homeless Americans on any given night, there are 1.7 million uninsured veterans, and real statistics indicate that there's over a 20% unemployment rate. Now, I'm not advocating extorting people through taxation to pay for any of this. What I'm pointing out here is that politicians are far more interested in funding a wasteful government entity that likes to publish CGI photos and videos when that money could have actually benefited people who really need it. And ironically, or fittingly, however you want to look at it, NASA has hired Star Trek's William Shatner to narrate for their new propaganda push. Here's what Shatner tells us they're gonna do.
We're going to the moon to stay by 2024.
Maybe after this part, Shatner should have added,
to boldly go where no man has gone before.
But in order to go to the moon, he tells us what we have to overcome.
We must overcome radiation.
What? Why must we overcome something we already overcame? You're talking like we haven't done these things before or something. Apparently, according to NASA's own engineer, Kelly Smith, overcoming radiation is something we haven't done before.
My name is Kelly Smith, and I work on navigation and guidance for Orion. As we get further away from Earth, we'll pass through the Van Allen belts, an area of dangerous radiation.
You know, that radiation they supposedly already skated through in the Apollo missions from 1969 to 1972 in their tin can wrapped with copious amounts of aluminum foil?
Radiation like this could harm the guidance systems, onboard computers, or other electronics on Orion. Naturally, we have to pass through this danger zone twice, once up and once back. But Orion has protection. Shielding will be put to the test as the vehicle cuts through the waves of radiation. Sensors aboard will record radiation levels for scientists to study. We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Wait, what?
We must solve these challenges before we send people through this region of space.
Hold on a second. I thought we already solved these challenges way back in 1969. It's 2019. We've got 50 years of exponentially expanding technology behind us. How exactly is it that we have to solve these challenges that were conquered a half a century ago? I'll tell you what, since we already threw so much money at it in the 60s and 70s, and since the program works so consistently well, why don't we just fire up the old Apollo program? Then we won't have to solve any of these challenges because we've got a program that already solved them. Wait, what's this?
In a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
We don't have the technology to go to the moon anymore because we destroyed the technology? Guys, I'm not making any of this stuff up. And I'm not making any assertions here, YouTube, so cool your jets. NASA, even in its own multi-million-dollar propaganda video, is telling us that humans can't make it through the deadly radiation, and we don't have the technology to go to the moon because the people we paid to keep all that information safe decided to destroy it. I got an idea. Let's defund NASA. They just admitted they've been lying to us. And let's just take all that money and help some veterans and some homeless people. Now, just as a side note, when I watched NASA's video, it had 524,716 views, 49,075 likes, 1,480 dislikes, and strangely, 0 comments. So I left a comment of my own. Were people that speechless at the $50 million per day worth of CGI? While people are homeless and starving and veterans are neglected? I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. But the problem is, we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back. NASA's astronaut, Don Pettit. Leave your thoughts about this for the world, the Google Thought Police, and all the talented CGI artists and movie crews at NASA in the comment section below.
What's your instrument? What do you do when you get up in the morning, doctor? What do you do? And he says, it's all in my head. I think. I said, well, how do you prove what you're thinking exists? Because it's all theory. He said, well, I've got this very elegant numbers equation, yeah. Very E/B divided into 7 to 4. It's all in his head. How do you prove a black hole? How do you know those gravitational waves proved the collision of 2 black holes?
Somehow, eventually, they are able to observe phenomena.
No, they can't observe. It's too far away. It's too theoretical. How do we know what they're saying is true? You know what it really is? It's all science fiction.
So does that make you a skeptic?
No, well, science fiction says this is a story that I'm making up, and there's this thing called wormholes, and that's a science fiction concept. Although these scientists say there are wormholes. How do you know?
The mystery of science fiction is what I'm talking about. Science and science fiction are essentially the same.
50 years ago, we produced the moon landing hoax. The trailblaze filled with science fiction fooled us all with the impossible. Today, the crowds we exploit are even greater. To live farther, we must be able to sustain fictions of greater distance and duration. Your minds are the resources we harvest with our machinations. We pretend to overcome radiation, isolation, gravity, and extreme environments as we've always done. That's the video game we created to bind the minds of humanity. We're producing another moon hoax, a play, by 2024. And this is how.
We want to believe we have the ability to get larger, heavier payloads of planets beyond Earth's gravity. For this, we simulate an entirely new rocket, Space Life System. SLS be the most wasteful rocket ever developed.
And without CGI production.
And more enticing, this game system makes you think we can fly deep space missions. We feed you lies in capsules for you to believe our game, from wasteful launches to CGI fake space and the good old parachute trick. For this trick, we built Orion. This is NASA's next generation human space fiction. Inventing fake data and maps from lunar orbiters, our programmers create many moon hazards and resources. We're currently producing an entirely new hoax to landing and operating on the moon. Funding our commercial partners with your money to make up science instruments and robotic props, you are paying our way for human fictions in 2024.
Our task is to hoax quickly and to keep it going, to cash our production efforts with a fervor that can convince the weak, that we return to the moon in a manner that is wholly different than 50 years ago.
With our simulated reusable lunar landers, we pretend to land anywhere on our CGI lunar surface map. To sustain this fiction, we give him a platform in orbit around the moon from which to transition. A canister-shaped platform to fake deep space experiments and be a mental dead zone for non-thinking humans. We call this loony outpost Gateway. The beauty of the Gateway trick is that we say it moves between orbits, balancing it at will between the Earth's and Moon's gravity, with a fiction that is ideal for producing even deeper space missions. In 2009, we learned that the Moon contained millions of space believer minds. These minds can be extracted and purified like water and separated into oxygen for breathing or hygiene for rocket fuel. This new Moon hoax is quite uniquely designed to deceive us and propel us to Mars and beyond.
I shit you not believe it.
This is where we're tricking more.
This is a replicate throughout the solar fiction.
This is the next charmer for human space exploitation.
Humans are the most malleable subjects in this entire production, and yet we lie for humanity. We go to the moon and on to Mars to fake knowledge and understand it, and to spread lies everywhere. We lie knowing our stories will further new fictions that cannot be foreseen. We lie because we're destined to exploit you and deceive you, controlling all minds. We want another moon hoax now, a better illusion, to serve as reinforcement, as a checkpoint for all the lies we told, our fakest adventures still ahead of us. We are faking it.
We're hoaxing. We are hoaxing it. We are hoaxing. We're hoaxing.
This world is not what you think it is. This world is not what you think it is.